So, hi everybody, my name is Maddie Adkins. I'm actually not in Minnesota. I'm way over on the West Coast in Eugene, Oregon currently because I'm attending the University of Oregon studying environmental studies. So I'm really excited for today's speaker call because we have a really incredible speaker from one of my favorite organizations. And so some of you may have read the book, Project Drawdown, about the 100 solutions to climate change. And before we get into it, Katharine has a really awesome slideshow to share with you guys. Before we jump in, I'd just like to ask Katharine to tell us a little bit about your story and how you got involved in Drawdown, and even why you chose to study the environment.
Sure. It's so nice to be with you all tonight. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, where it's rapidly getting dark. I watched a few videos of what you all are up to, and I'm super inspired by the change that you are fomenting in all of your communities. So thank you all for a burst of inspiration. Yeah, how did it all start? For sure, teachers played a really important role in elementary school, in junior high. And then I had a really kind of formative experience when I was in high school. I spent the spring semester of my sophomore year at a place called the Outdoor Academy in Pisgah Forest, North Carolina. So I lived in the woods for 4 months with 25 kids, which was super fun. And we kind of continued with our regular coursework, but we also had a big emphasis on environmental issues and sustainability in our literature class, in natural history, and an environmental science class, in the creative writing that we did, and then, of course, in the way that we lived. And so it was just I don't know, it was a time when kind of my head and heart and hands all connected around these issues. And I sort of haven't looked back since then, which doesn't mean that I've always known what to do with that passion, but it fueled a lot of activism in when I got back to Atlanta in high school, and then in college, although I majored in religion when I was in undergrad, because to me, environmental issues are actually big issues of who are we and why are we here and where are we going and what is our relationship to this planet that we call home. And after undergrad, I worked for a big environmental group called the Natural Resources Defense Council, and then went to graduate school just a year after that. And I did a PhD in environmental studies, and I was really interested in this sort of what was at the time this kind of emerging climate movement among evangelical Christians in the US. So that's what I did my PhD research on. I published that as a book in 2012 called Between God and Green. And I spent a few years doing consulting work of different kinds. And through that work, I ended up working with a company that my now boss, Paul Hawken, has advised for many, many years, called Interface, which was founded by a man named Ray Anderson, who some of you all may know. I'm like really tempted to grab books. This is one of Ray's books, Mid-Course Correction. And in the process of doing work with Interface, I met Paul, I learned about Drawdown, and it was kind of lucky timing that it was time to bring the book Drawdown to life. And I had the right skill set to help do that. So that's where we are. The book came out a year ago, and I've spent a lot of the last year on the road giving talks. So thank you all for inviting me to do this from my home. You can't tell, but I have pajama pants on. So that's especially nice.
I do too. I feel called out. Thank you so much. That's such an awesome, yeah. I especially love the part where you talked about how you had this passion, but you didn't really know what you're going to do with it. I think I definitely relate to that. And a lot of us as young people are feeling that right now, but to know that you're here and you are doing such amazing things is super inspiring. So I think without further ado, we would love to see the presentation that you prepared for us.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you, Maddie. Okay, we are in. Can everyone see okay?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, wonderful. So I'm gonna start somewhere that's a little bit of a joke, but also a little bit serious, which is with emojis. So when I kind of step back and think about this, the story that we have been hearing and telling one another about climate change over the last couple of decades, it generally goes something like this. This is an oversimplification, but we have incredible science that tells us we're in bad shape. The science tells us that it's going to get much worse if we don't have a dramatic change of course. We are headed towards a potentially unlivable planet, and we're not super well equipped as a human species to tackle these kinds of long-term global systemic challenges. So change your light bulbs, recycle your Coke cans, and cross your fingers that people in the halls of power will get this figured out, and maybe some geniuses in Silicon Valley will invent some silver bullet solutions. And I don't know about you all, but when this is the dominant story that I hear, I feel depressed, overwhelmed, panicked, hopeless, guilty, a whole host of reactions that are really reasonable, but not very good foundations for action. And presumably, action is exactly what we're aiming for. And I think you actually start to hear underneath a lot of the ways that we talk about climate change, this message that human beings are terrible, horrible, no good, very bad, greedy, lazy, incompetent, and all the rest. And that also is not a particularly energizing way to think about who we are. And so we're trying to rally people up, but in the way that we've been talking about climate change, we've had the opposite impact. So what we have tried to do in this book, Drawdown, is to tell another side of the story. And that story is very much laser focused on the solutions to address global warming. So our founder and executive director, Paul Hawken, found himself asking sort of a persistent set of questions over a number of years. Here we have this incredible body of science that tells us about the problem of global warming. Do we have the same kind of clarity on what we should be doing to address it? Do we know what tools we have in our toolbox? And you have a lot of people looking at the challenge of climate change and thinking, this is totally impossible. We can't possibly tackle this. And what Paul wanted to know was, okay, let's do the math and ask, using the solutions that we already have, the technologies and practices that we're already using, we already know they work, let's see what is possible over the next 30 years. And so eventually, after kind of thinking about the need for this list, this catalog of the most substantive solutions to address climate change, Paul ended up founding Project Drawdown to do that work, to map, measure, and model the most important solutions to reverse global warming. So that's what we have been up to. And this book is, you can think of it as kind of a first snapshot of our work. And we continue with our research and our communication as well. This is very much a project brought to life by a community. So these are photographs of research fellows who have worked on the project over the last few years. We've had about 65 research fellows from 22 countries and 6 continents. And we have also a really incredible international body of advisors, about 120 folks who are experts in all aspects of climate science, policy, advocacy, you name it. They have lent their brain power to this project. So think of this very much as a collaborative global effort. You all have probably seen something like this slide before. So I think about this as basically the problem statement of climate change, if we were to kind of boil it down onto one page. And I wanted to use this slide because it helps to answer what's in this name drawdown. What is the word drawdown all about? So we are now at about 410 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And as you all know very well, that is what's causing global warming to occur. If you added in other greenhouse gases, in addition to carbon dioxide, we would be up around 490 parts per million. The human species has never before lived in these atmospheric conditions. And yet, so often in the climate space, what we hear are aspirations to slow emissions, to reduce emissions, to stabilize at somewhere up in this unknown territory for human existence. And when you step back and you think about this reality of living in a world that we've never lived in before, it seems absolutely bonkers to slow or stabilize up in this terra nova. You can think about it, right? If we're driving down the wrong road toward a cliff, we don't want to go over the cliff more slowly. We want to actually turn around and go back the other way. And that is what drawdown, the term, means. Drawdown is the point in time at which greenhouse gases peak. I don't know if you all can see my mouse moving, but could peak and then begin to decline on a year-to-year basis. So drawdown is really that point of turning around and heading back the other way, heading back towards the conditions that we know are most conducive for life on this planet. And what we found when we got into our work is that human beings have actually been making a plan to get to drawdown. We just didn't realize that that is what we had been doing, because we are so many humans on such a big planet, and we have been out in backyards and forests and farms. We've been in factories, laboratories, companies, universities, testing different technologies and practices, learning about what works, maybe what doesn't work so well, refining and trying again. And along the way, we have built up really incredible data and research about all of these solutions. So our job at Project Drawdown wasn't to make up what we think the most comprehensive plan is to reverse global warming. It was actually to gather this collective wisdom of humanity, what it is that we already know based on things that we're already doing, and then to bring that together into one place, one study, one book, and share back to humanity, reflect back to humanity what it is that we already know. And we wanted to do that not in yet another dry, boring, wonky climate report. We wanted to do it in a way that was really accessible, that anyone could understand, that didn't sort of bog people down in weird jargon or hard to understand acronyms or terminology. We really wanted it to be a document that could educate and inspire. So if you want to get to Drawdown, there are basically two things you can do. And this first one is the one that we talk about most of the time. So we want to avoid sending more greenhouse gases up into the atmosphere. And you can think about all of the many ways we know to do that, right? Whether that's swapping out dirty energy for clean, renewable energy, using measures for energy efficiency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a whole other side of the equation that we have not given as much attention to. And that is really about bringing carbon back home. So sometimes I feel like carbon becomes this like evil villain in, again, kind of our stories and our language around climate change. But the issue is not carbon. Carbon is a really fundamental building block of life. The issue is what we humans have done with carbon, which is to say we've taken too much of it from down here on planet Earth, and we've sent it up into the atmosphere. But guess what is a really powerful, quote unquote, technology for bringing carbon back down to Earth? Of course, it's what nature has been working on for 3.8 billion years, which is photosynthesis. So we look in Drawdown at a whole bunch of solutions that can bring carbon back home, can bring us back into balance by using the power of photosynthesis and sequestering carbon in biomass, right, plants, trees, and soil. So when we go through some of the solutions in Drawdown, you'll see that some of them avoid emissions, some of them enhance biosequestration, and some of them do a mix of both. We organized our work around these these sort of sectors of impact, these groupings of solutions: electricity, food, women and girls, buildings and cities, land use, transport, and materials. There are 80 solutions in the book that fall into these sectors. And I like to think of them as the trains that have already left the station. So these are the solutions that we can already see in the world. They're being used successfully. They're scaling, growing, at least in some places. And then there are also 20 solutions at the end of the book that we call coming attractions. So these are solutions that are scientifically sound and they show a lot of promise, but maybe they're still in research and development. They're still emerging. We don't have the same kind of data about them to do the kinds of calculations that we did on the other solutions. I want to just pause really quickly and make sure we don't have any kind of urgent questions for clarification. Larry, has anything come in?
Nope.
Okay,
You're good.
perfect. We'll save kind of bigger questions for the end, but if at any point anyone has an urgent question for clarification, just raise your hand or put it into the chat. I want to make sure I don't keep going without clarifying something that needs clarifying. So these are the top 20 solutions in Drawdown. And there are some pretty interesting insights and surprises and maybe some unsung heroes that make their way into this top 20. So I thought what we would do is I'll talk a little bit about kind of the sectors, and then share with you all a handful of the solutions, just to give you kind of a flavor for what you can find on our website and in the book. So the first thing that I think is really interesting and really powerful is that the food sector is 8 of the top 20 solutions, and it is the largest sector of impact overall, which is pretty amazing. You know, a lot of times we talk about climate change as being an energy problem that needs energy and energy efficiency solutions. And of course, those things are absolutely vital, but it's not the whole story. And food is about what we produce, how we produce it, and also addressing waste so that we don't have to produce quite so much. So the number 9 solution is SILVOPASTURE. I don't know about you all, but I would not have put SILVOPASTURE on my guess of the top 10 list for climate solutions. SILVOPASTURE, the Latin means forest and grazing, which tells you most of what you need to know about silvopasture. Conventional wisdom would tell us that cows and trees don't mix, but this is actually a really ancient practice of integrating livestock, maybe a fruit or a nut crop, perhaps timber. It's great for farmers for a whole host of reasons, but the reason why silvopasture makes it into Drawdown is because if you compare a pasture with trees to a pasture without trees, the pasture with trees sequesters 5 to 10 times more carbon than the pasture without trees. So in other words, a pasture begins to function a little bit more like a forest than it does just a piece of largely barren land. And I'm going to use this slide to talk a little bit about the numbers, about the kind of key pieces of our analysis that our research team did. So the first one is this one, 31.19 gigatons of reduced carbon dioxide. This is a good slide actually for talking about gigatons, because a gigaton is a billion tons. And a cow weighs about a ton. So you can imagine 1 gigaton of carbon dioxide is about 1 billion cows worth. That's how much it is. So we're talking about 31 billion cows worth when it comes to silvopasture. What does that mean? So what we looked at is if we were to take this solution of silvopasture, this practice of silvopasture, and we were to grow it globally between 2020 and 2050, how much biosequestration, carbon sequestration could silvopasture do over that 30 years? And across the board, what we tried to do when asking this kind of scaling, growing question was, well, let's imagine that silvopasture can expand vigorously, but plausibly. So we didn't want to be totally pie in the sky, and we didn't want to be super conservative. We wanted to kind of be quite middle of the road in terms of our assumptions about how much these solutions could grow in their use over 30 years. Not all of the solutions impact carbon dioxide. Some of them impact other greenhouse gases or multiple greenhouse gases, but there's pretty simple math that allows you to translate, let's say, a greenhouse gas like methane into its equivalent in carbon dioxide. So you'll see everything reported the same way in reduced CO2, because that's what lets us do an apples to apples comparison, this ranking 1 through 80 of the solutions. We also thought it was really important to look at the economics of these solutions. So how much does it cost to implement SILVOPASTURE at that scale over 30 years? And this is net cost to implement. And what that means is, what's the additional money that's going to be required to create SILVOPASTURE systems rather than regular pasture systems? Or you could imagine, how much more is it going to cost to purchase electric vehicles as opposed to regular gasoline-powered cars? And then we also wanted to look at how much money do you save when you operate this solution over 30 years? Or in this case, how much extra money will farmers make because they're raising livestock and fruit or nuts and timber all on the same piece of land rather than just livestock? So you can see here, farmers would have extra revenue of almost $700 billion over 30 years. I'm going to ask the question one more time, because this is a lot of kind of nitty gritty. So let me know if there's any need for clarification on the numbers piece.
Yeah, quick question.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that now you're talking about cows, you're talking about methane reduction?
Here we're talking about biosequestration. So we're talking about carbon sequestration in biomass and in soil. It's a great point. So SILVOPASTURE doesn't have any impact on how much methane cows produce. We'll actually get to another solution that touches on that point. But the sequestration is significant enough that it more than makes up for the methane emissions. But it's a great question. And the methane emissions, for those who don't know, cows are ruminants, which means that they do this kind of double digestive process. And in the process of that, they produce quite a lot of methane. Sheep are the same way. And contrary to popular opinion, most of it is burped out rather than coming out the other end.
I had a question. On the website for the list of solutions, I noticed some of the solutions, the savings is negative. Why is that?
Yeah, so in some cases, you may have a negative net cost, or you may have a negative net savings. Now, what is that about? In most cases, it costs money to implement one solution rather than what we call, business as usual. In a few cases, you actually save money in the implementation. So for example, it's less expensive to create a geothermal power plant than it is to produce a coal-fired power plant. Similarly, on the savings side, most of the solutions have a net savings over 30 years. In a few cases, and we'll actually come to one in just a minute, it costs more money to operate that solution over 30 years than business as usual. And I'll explain a little bit more when we get to that example.
I think we
So-
also had a question from Craig, who had raised his hand.
Yeah. So as far as this goes, how do you know in like the new United States specifically how food regulation, how this might affect food regulation? You were talking about producing maybe fruit in the pasture. If like, would there be legislative change or regulation change that would need to happen?
So if I can, let's hold on some of these specifics, and kind of come to Q&A at the end, because I want to make sure that we cover some ground. We could go way into detail on all of these. So hold it and let's come back to it. I just want to make sure on these, if there are any like critical clarification questions, let's get them, but let's if you guys will hang with me, let's keep rolling.
Got it.
Cool. So food waste, number 3 solution in Drawdown, also pretty interesting, pretty surprising. These are rejected carrots and potatoes that are too ugly to be sold in a grocery store. No one would want to buy them. And this is true of about a third of the food that we produce. So a third of the food that we produce is not consumed. At some point along its journey, it gets abandoned and is not eaten. In high-income countries like ours, we tend to waste food by choice. So we buy too much, we overserve. Restaurants have huge portions. We forget about leftovers in the back of the fridge, etc. And of course, at every stage of the journey of food, we're having huge investments in it, of energy and transport and labor and capital. And so there are emissions tied to every stage of the journey of food. So if we can intervene and avoid food waste, that's a huge opportunity, particularly because we cut down forests to grow more food that we don't eat. And uneaten food often ends up in a landfill where it creates methane, which is a greenhouse gas about 30 times as potent as carbon dioxide. This is cool because it's a solution anyone can impact immediately and at no cost. And it's also one where policy can have a big impact. So in France and Italy, for example, it is now illegal for grocery stores to throw away edible food. So it ends up in the hands of people who need it. Maybe it ends up feeding pigs on a pig farm. At the very least, it goes to a compost pile instead of going to a landfill. Electricity, as you might suspect, is 5 of the top 20 solutions, and it is the second largest sector for impact overall. This is one of my favorite photographs from the book. This is an Uru family. They live on Lake Titicaca, and they have just gotten this solar panel and a battery storage system, which means that for the first time, these girls will not have to do their homework at night by kerosene lamp. And that's a huge thing for this family because kerosene lamps are very expensive to operate and they're extremely polluting. So really not good for indoor air quality and health. And what we tried to do throughout the book, as you can see here, is to bring to life some of the sort of human stories about these solutions. We can all kind of imagine what a house with a rooftop solar system looks like. We've seen those photographs before. But what this photograph does is to help tell another part of the story, which is that rooftop solar or distributed solar is also a really incredible solution for the 1.1 billion people around the world who don't have access to electricity today. So this is a climate solution for sure, but it's also a solution for addressing poverty and improving livelihoods around the world. And you can see here, there's a big net savings of almost $3.5 trillion in home energy costs over 30 years. Land use comes in next. These are solutions that are focused on protecting and restoring ecosystems for the most part. This is an image of a harvested peatland. The Irish poet Seamus Heaney wrote some wonderful poems about Irish bogs, and in one of them he describes the ground itself is kind black butter. Why is that? Because a bog or a peatland is made of layers and layers and layers of decomposing organic matter. That's about 50% carbon. Peatlands are only 3% of the Earth's land area, but they are second only to oceans in the amount of carbon that they hold, which is pretty amazing. Peatlands are under threat from forestry and farming and fires, but we have an incredible opportunity to expand the acreage of protected peatlands and ensure that the carbon that they hold stays where it is and that they keep sequestering more carbon over time. This is kind of a surprising solution. We didn't see this one coming, number one. This is a solution that's focused on the chemicals, the chemical refrigerants that we use in our air conditioning units and our refrigerators, basically all of the machinery that helps us keep ourselves or other things cold. You all may have learned about the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol was something that the world adopted in the 1980s in response to the ozone hole. There were chemical refrigerants we were using at the time called CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, that were contributing to the ozone hole. So we phased them out, we stopped using CFCs, and we replaced them with HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, which are great on the one hand because they don't cause the same damage to the ozone layer. Not so great. They are 1,000 times or more as potent as carbon dioxide, as greenhouse gases. And you can imagine they're everywhere. They're in our cars and our kitchens and our vending machines, our homes, our offices. HFCs are all over the place. So what we've looked at here is the opportunity to better manage leaks and disposal of HFCs. So making sure that they don't seep out into the atmosphere, they're actually handled in a way that they are contained and don't contribute to climate change. Women and girls is a sector that surprises some folks. They haven't maybe thought about gender equity and the rights of women and girls as being solutions to address global warming. But it turns out that they very, very much are. And of course, all of the drawdown solutions are relevant to women and girls, and there are some, like number 21, which is clean cook stoves, that have a disproportionate benefit for women and girls' health and well-being. But with these solutions, we've really looked at areas where there are inequalities around gender, and that the impact addressing those inequalities ends up having for emissions and for climate change. So this young woman is clearly in school. She is in Kenya, but there are 130 million girls around the world who are of school age, but they're not in school today. And why does that matter? For so many reasons, for health and jobs and families and communities. But also it turns out that with more years of education, women decide with their partners to have smaller families. And the families that they do have, the children they do have more resources invested in them, and they are healthier. And if you think about just one family, the difference of one child doesn't seem like it makes such a big difference. But if you add that up over 30 years, it could have very much to do with how many feet are walking around making their carbon footprints on this planet as of 2050. So we've looked at here the impact of arriving at a smaller global population size at mid-century by virtue not of what you used to hear in the environmental movement, population control, but actually of empowerment and choice for women and girls. And even though we have talked about the top 20 solutions, there is actually no such thing as a small drawdown solution. And why is that? We have an entire system that has created the challenge of climate change, and we need an entire system of solutions to address it. And the solutions are so tied to one another. We need all of these solutions and then some. Just gonna zip quickly through a couple more slides. I'll skip this one, but because we talked about methane, I'll mention this. This is a coming attraction. A cow walks onto a beach, which is about a species of red algae that, if fed as a supplement to cows and sheep, has the impact of reducing their methane emissions by 70 to 90%. It's kind of amazing. I highly recommend at least checking out on our website a little bit more detail about that one. And I just want to kind of very quickly wrap up kind of with coming back to where we started, which is this message of doom and gloom, threat and fear, humans are terrible, horrible, no good, very bad. And I think when you come not through the lens of the problem of climate change, but you come through the lens of the solutions, it becomes really clear that there is this other side of the story, and that humans are certainly capable of being terrible, horrible, no good, and very bad, but we are also capable of being collaborative, committed, compassionate, creative, of coming together in community to make a difference for one another, for other living beings, and for future generations. And I think all too often, our friends in the climate space are very good at giving an "I have a nightmare" speech. And we forget sometimes about the other side, about the vision of what's possible, about the dream that might inspire us around the world that we can build through addressing climate change to arrive at a society that is more vibrant, that is healthier, that's more equitable. It's not just about reducing emissions. It is actually also about building a more beautiful world. And I hope that Drawdown has made some contribution to painting a picture of that vision and helping all of us to hold a sense of what's possible through the things that we don't just have as tools we might use, but they're things that we already, in many cases, are using. We just need to scale them a whole bunch more over the next 30 years. So I'm gonna stop there, and maybe we can shift back into questions.
Well, first of all, Katharine, thank you so much. That was seriously one of the best presentations I've ever seen. So uplifting and so exciting, and so interesting. So yeah, definitely let's open it up to questions. If anybody wants to just jump in or raise their hand, we can do that way.
So can you explain again how you factored in like methane and how you would like use that for the comparison?
Sure. In general, how we looked at methane?
Yeah, did you like take that and like convert it to like how it would be similar to carbon dioxide and like put that on the scale? Is that how you did it?
Exactly. So, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the international body that does all of the great work synthesizing the world's climate science, they have a very agreed upon kind of set of formulas for how you take any given greenhouse gas and convert it into its carbon dioxide equivalent. That's the technical term, CO2 EQ, you'll sometimes see. So that's what we used to do that. So for example, we didn't talk about it, but solution number 4 is what we call a plant-rich diet. So methane is a big piece of why that solution is so big. But of course, methane isn't the only greenhouse gas that's associated with livestock production. We have lots of energy use and lots of fertilizer use, which is nitrous oxide. So all of those get kind of put together into one big clump, but translated into CO2 EQ.
We also have a really good question from Kelly. Kelly, you want to go off mute and ask that?
Yeah, sure. I just would like to know, what are your views on the degrowth strategy as an option to tackle CO2 emissions, Katharine? And how important would it be for the Drawdown project to promote the need to lower the consumerism along with the proposed technical and technological solutions? Because as far as I understand, it is, even when we have already green technological solutions to address the emissions of the actual, the way that we get energy today, even like that, it will be very difficult to reduce emissions if we continue to consume as the rhythm as we do today, even with green technologies.
Thank you. It's a great question, and one that our research team is continuing to grapple with. So there are key examples of reduced consumption in the book. So plant-rich diets and reducing food waste are great examples. For anything to make it into the book as a solution, it had to be something that has already been really well studied, that there's really good data about, and that's already scaling in the world. So there are certain things that clearly have a huge impact that we weren't able to include in our models. Another example would be the impact of peace. Right? So war is extremely energy intensive, emissions intensive. So that's a huge area of opportunity. It was beyond the scope of kind of what we could do the math on for this book. So overall reduction in consumption is enormously important, right? We know that there's that very classic IPAT equation that impact is a factor of population, affluence, or consumption and technology, that all of these things are dynamics that are coming together. So it's something that we tried to tease out kind of in the text of the book, but you don't see it as a standalone solution.
Thanks.
Looking at the solutions that are in like the book, what are like the top ones that like every day that people, like anybody can do every day?
Yeah. So there are a lot, and I think it's worth kind of thinking about, for any given solution, there may be a bunch of different ways in to impact it, right? So we talked about this a little bit with food waste. That's something that all of us can tackle, all of our schools, all of our workplaces can tackle. It's something that can be addressed more systemically through the work that food banks do, through addressing policy, like the example I was giving. So for any solution, there may not be just one level of agency that can impact it. It could be that you can come in many different ways. It depends for any individual kind of where you live, what your context is, what kinds of financial resources you have, what sorts of infrastructure surrounds you. You know, we like the idea that there's real simplicity to like, well, everybody can do these 10 things. Well, you know, I live in a condo, so I can't put solar panels on my roof, even if I could afford them. But if you're a homeowner, maybe you can put solar on your roof. If you live in a city that has great mass transit or great bicycle infrastructure, you have really good alternatives to driving a car. But if you live in a place where that infrastructure doesn't exist, you might not have those same options. So I think it always comes down to thinking about kind of your unique place in the world and the opportunities that you have at hand. I also think that in Drawdown, you start to see that there are footholds of action for every individual and every institution on the planet. And there are also way more footholds of action than anyone could possibly do on their own. And so I think it's worth remembering, one, that the most important action we do is collective action. And I like to think about kind of individual choices as being things that help me stay grounded in my values and keep me kind of true to myself and keep me energized about doing more than just things as me, but actually doing things as we. So I've been vegetarian since going to the Outdoor Academy almost 20 years ago. I think that's really important, individual action, but even more than just the kind of bunch of emissions that I have avoided through diet over the last 2 decades. That choice has given me a way to kind of reflect 3 times a day on what I care about and a sense of interconnectedness with this planet. So that's sort of a rambly and not so simple answer, but I would encourage you to use Drawdown as kind of a choose your own adventure story for yourself, for your family, but also for your community.
And I know that we're at time, so if any of you have to drop off, that's okay. I just wanted to give, for our last question, Craig a chance to re-ask the question that he had, and then we'll go ahead and wrap.
Okay. I don't know. This was really highly specific, and I just kind of thought of it when you mentioned it. But with silvo farming, I was just wondering if there would be any obstacles in terms of like food regulation and safety in using the same piece of land to with livestock and produce.
So it's a really interesting question. Not that I know of, and not that I've ever heard of. We do a lot of silvopasture in Georgia with pecan trees and pine trees and all sorts of things. I'm sure there are scenarios where there could be issues, but I have never heard of that. So if you do any digging, let me know if you come across anything.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katharine. This has been an awesome speaker call. I hope all of you enjoyed it. I know that I really, really, really enjoyed this presentation a lot. And I am so happy that we all got to share this time together. So without, anybody has any further questions, you guys can email us and we can try to pass that along to Katharine. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
I have
It's really
one
great.
quick question. Where can I buy this book?
Oh, you can get it in almost any bookstore. You can definitely get it on Amazon.
There's also this really great poster that I think if you donate $20 to Project Drawdown, they'll send you this poster that has all of the solutions on it. You can hang it on your wall, which I think I'm going to do because it'll be a great reminder that it's possible to stop and reverse climate change. So
The poster, yeah, the poster is cool. I could imagine it. If we can figure out how to get some posters to iMatter, I feel like it would be really a great tool for you all to take in when you with your city councils as well.
yeah, that'd be awesome.
Oh, yes, 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 yes.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, folks.
Thank you,
Have a good
everyone.
rest of your night.
Good night, everyone. Keep up the amazing work.